Hello and welcome. We would like to welcome you to today's webinar. My name is Gonzalo Vega, Sales Manager at Qrik Mexico. Qrik is the leading provider of cloud ERP solutions for manufacturers. And this webinar is made possible thanks to the collaboration of Ecosystem, Mexico Now, and Qrik. And our main goal today is that you can learn something new that can put you into action and can help you and your organizations succeed in the disruptive time we are living. Today, we will have two speakers. Kathy Fisher, she is president and founder of Ecosystem LLC. She is an expert in ISO 9000 and IATF 6949. And also Terry Onika, she is director of automotive at Qrik. She is expert in MMOGLE and everything related to automotive. And just as a little housekeeping before we start, this webinar will be placed in listen-only mode, and it will take about 45 minutes. If you have any questions during the presentation, please type them into the question box in the Q&A in your panel, and we will have these sometime questions at the end. And this webinar will be recorded and will be shared with you as soon as it is ready. So let's start. Thank you, Kathy.
Thank you, Gonzalo, and welcome everyone. Certainly in these days, we are all living with disruptions. And as we consider some of the disruptions that we've experienced in the past 12 months, not only has the COVID virus impacted every business, not just the automotive industry, but now we're facing further disruptions, specifically in the automotive industry with the recent semiconductor shortage. And we're also hearing about other shortages in certain types of raw materials, such as steel, and even some of the rare mineral components that are used in battery manufacture. In considering these impacts to your organization, we wanted to share with you today some ideas of how you can shift the focus within your business towards more of a supply chain focus. And so what we'd like to cover in today's webinar is, first of all, we want to check in with you in terms of your organization's current supply chain performance. Then we'd like to share with you the three systemic root causes of why supply chain instability exists in the automotive industry. Then we're going to give you some perspective on why it's important beyond just delivery performance to ensure that your organization is shifting your focus more to a supply chain operation so that you can sustain your delivery to your customers. We'll then turn to a 5-step roadmap that we've developed that helps your organization move towards a sustainable supply chain performance. And of course, we'll end with some next steps for your organization. Next slide, please. So let's start by finding out your organization's current supply chain performance. We'd love to have you join us in this poll. And we'd like to know, is your organization's delivery performance to your automotive customers currently 100% on time and in full? So maybe you think back this past month, maybe since the beginning of the year. Let us know what has been your delivery performance to your automotive customers. And you could just answer yes, no, and maybe some of you are unsure. That's okay as well. So we really want to find out where you stand in terms of your delivery performance. And we're also going to share with you what we're seeing in the industry right now as well. Danielle, do you want to pull us those poll results and see what we have? Aha, okay, so we suspected that we would see this type of result. 64% of you responding indicate that no, right now, your delivery performance to your customers is not 100% on time in full. That's not surprising because we've actually experienced the same thing. And in fact, this is not just a recent trend, this has been an ongoing trend in the industry for quite some time. Let's take a look at the next slide, please. As we consider the view of the automotive supply chain, historically, the automotive supply chain is viewed very linearly with a relationship between the tiers, if we will, of the supply chain, communicating only with each other in succession. And in fact, even though we show service on the supply chain, unfortunately, we tend to find that that's oftentimes not thought of or afterthought for many manufacturers. I want you to think about who is missing in this view of the current automotive supply chain. And this is going to come back around as we talk about the importance of shifting more towards a supply chain focus in your organization. Let's take the next slide. So to just emphasize the importance of supply chain in your organization, this is a little quiz. Find out what you know about the extent of costs that are incorporated into a vehicle based on the raw materials and parts. So what do you think the percent of cost of a new vehicle is that can be attributed to raw materials and the parts that go into the vehicle? So we can either have 15%, 45%, 60%, or 90%. Let's see how we do with this. Danielle, let's see the poll results for this one. Good. So you guys are actually undershooting just a little bit. So 50% of you said 45%. Would you believe that currently it's around 60%? 60% of the cost of a new vehicle is actually in the raw materials and new parts and components. And we just actually saw a study recently related to battery electric vehicles, so that new technology that's coming on, where with those battery electric vehicles, raw materials and components is going to make up as much as 75 to 80% of the cost of a new vehicle. Now, that's a compelling reason to recognize that as automotive manufacturers, we have to focus on our supply chain and making sure we're managing the supply chain effectively. Next slide, please. However, the question is, how do we do that with all of these disruptions that we're facing? And in fact, it seems like managing disruptions is the basis of doing business today, not just in the automotive industry. Certainly other industries are also being impacted by these various disruption events that are happening globally. However, how we address these disruptions relative to our business operations really makes the difference between sustainable success in terms of customer satisfaction and eventually going out of business. In particular, with these disruption events, one thing I want to bring to your attention is that regardless of these disruption events, your customers, especially in the automotive industry, still expect 100% on-time delivery all the time. So how do you accomplish that? How can you possibly achieve that when your organization is experiencing delivery issues, as you folks have actually shared with us already? Let's take a look at the next slide. So I'd like to hear from you about how your organization is addressing these delivery issues when you hear from your customers that you're not hitting the mark in terms of their delivery expectations. So based on either delivery issues with your suppliers or with your customers, how often do you feel like your organization's getting to the real root cause of these delivery issues and that you're able to truly prevent recurrence of these delivery issues relative to delivering to your customer or dealing with your suppliers? So I'd like to know, is that always you're getting to the root cause? Sometimes, almost never, or maybe you're not sure? All right, Danielle, tell us what we have for results on this poll. Sometimes, okay, we have to do better than that, right? We definitely need to do better than that. I'm glad it's not almost never, but we need to understand what's really behind these disruptions. Let's go to the next slide, because I'd like to share with you the 3 systemic root causes that we've uncovered through our research and working with organizations that really are behind these delivery performance issues that your automotive manufacturers are not very happy with, and that they're giving you the feedback in terms of addressing. And so the first is around supply chain processes not being well defined within your organization. Now, many of you are aware that because of standards such as IATF 16949, the automotive quality standard, quality management systems and a focus on the quality processes in your organization have greatly improved over the years. However, there's not been as great a focus on supply chain processes. In fact, for a lot of manufacturers, they don't even think about supply chain processes because many outsource supply chain to third-party logistics providers or maybe even some other organizations. Even within their organization, the processes that most automotive manufacturers undertake related to supply chain tend to be happening behind the scenes and are not viewed as having a significant impact on the success of the organization. We have identified 24 key processes within your organization that, by the way, actually connect with your quality management processes that will ensure your organization has better delivery performance to your customers And you can sustain that delivery performance because your processes are building a strong foundation towards repeating delivery performance 100% to your customers all the time. So my colleague Terry is going to share with you what those 24 processes are in just a moment. The second systemic root cause that we've recognized in talking with organizations and actually working inside of those organizations is tends to be a knowledge gap related to supply chain competencies. And these supply chain competency gaps are something that we've really been experiencing across the automotive industry for at least the past decade. But we're really seeing an increase of loss of brain trust within many automotive manufacturers. And of course, COVID didn't help because many people ended up leaving the workplace in fear of the COVID virus and having to take care of their families in that as well. And so for many automotive manufacturers, they're falling even farther behind in terms of managing, maintaining, and developing supply chain competencies within their organizations. The key thing is we have to know what those supply chain processes are that are critical to the business in order to know what competencies to develop inside of the business as well. And so we're going to talk a little bit about some tools that are available to help your organization improve the supply chain competencies and close that knowledge gap. The third root cause that we've recognized has to do with automation and technology. Now, this was actually a key finding from recovery after the COVID shutdowns that occurred last year. And many organizations came forward and said they recognized the need to automate many of their processes within their organization, including supply chain processes. Unfortunately, what we see in many automotive manufacturers, and this is all the way up to the OEMs, is that they'll have a patchwork of different automation solutions that are connected by Excel spreadsheets. And there's not a continuous thread of data that's available in order to manage key information for decision-making and ensuring 100% on-time delivery all the time to our customers. So next slide. You might be wondering, why does this really matter? Why should I be concerned right now about my supply chain and how I'm managing my supply chain in my business? Well, we're here to tell you that it's not only your OEM customers that are concerned about supply chain, but ultimately the consumers. And if one big change, one big impact COVID has had, especially on the automotive industry, is on how consumers are buying their vehicles. They're going online. And if we think about other types of online experiences that we have in purchases that we make online, we tend to expect that that product is going to be available, right product, right place, and the right time. And in fact, my colleague Terry is going to share with you the benchmark that's actually driving the supply chain focus outside of automotive and consumer products and other industry sectors, which is really necessitating a shift to a supply chain focus in our operations as well. Terry, tell us a little bit about what that benchmark is.
Great. Thank you, Kathy. Gonzalo, next slide. So when you think about the person that is the champion of supply chain, it's Amazon. And when a lot of people think about Amazon, you think about buying products online. But what really makes Amazon successful is not necessarily the products that they sell, but it's the way they can manage the supply chain so effectively. During COVID, one of the things that we really learned and kind of instilled in all of us is this ability to order just about whatever I need and have it delivered to my home in 2 days. It's been such a great experience. Amazon really focuses on the customer and how to make them happy. So within 2 days, they can pretty much guarantee us any product that we'd like to have can be delivered to our doorstep. We also get it gets delivered. We get notified via email that it's there. They take a picture of it to show you that it's sitting on your front porch. We have this great experience. In fact, it's so funny. A lot of myself, when talking to myself, my family and friends, we're almost to the point where we're kind of addicted to Amazon, right? We love those packages showing up at our front doorstep and be able to open them up and have what we need because it's just so simple and easy. And so they're really conditioning us or training us about really effective delivery and that this can happen in a very short time frame. So it's really key. I know often even myself, if I have to order a product that I can't get on Amazon and it takes me 5 or 7 days to get it, Sometimes they even have to pay extra to get it in 5 or 7 days. I wonder to myself, what is wrong with this company that I can't get my products faster? So this real focus on customer and this real focus in their philosophy on supply chain has really helped them to be the best. Next slide. So as Kathy was talking about earlier, the supply chain is very linear today, but it's quickly and rapidly going to move from a linear supply chain to what we believe is an automotive ecosystem. And what does that mean? It's already happening today. And that, just like Amazon, the consumer, that person that's going to purchase a vehicle, is going to be the center of our world. That consumer is going to, when they place an order for a vehicle, the OEM is going to have to know they're going to have to build it. The supply chain is going to have to rapidly communicate on being able to get those products to the OEM on time. Transportation providers are going to have to be alerted as to when they're going to be able to deliver the vehicles. I believe the supply chain can get notification from certain parts in the car as their performance, and they may be talking directly to the service parts area to maybe say, we need a repair in the car, or maybe there's warranty work that needs to be done. So it's going to be very, very much an ecosystem, no more linear, but very much everybody focused around delivering to that consumer. And so this is where we really have to head in the future to have that same effect. And we also see today, or just yesterday, Volvo Car announced that they're only going to sell their electric vehicles online. We see Tesla does that. We even saw during COVID that switch to people were fearful to going into a dealership for contact with the people that worked at the dealership, and they were even turning to ordering cars online. And the vice president of Volkswagen is very fearful because they get this nice experience on the front end where you can order any car you want. But on the back end, he said, we are so disconnected. We're still running on spreadsheets and not really communicating as fast as we can. And he's very concerned about that. Another vice president from Volvo Cars said, you know what? Today, we really need to do some work because we're supply chain typically gets the table scraps, right? Typically, a lot of money goes towards engineering, R&D, quality, but supply chain gets what's ever left over. And that's going to really have to rapidly switch as we move forward in the future. Next slide. So how do we see this moving in the future? What's the roadmap that Kathy and I came up with? Well, there's a 5-step roadmap. First of all, we have to identify what are those essential supply chain processes. As we move towards a manufacturing-centered automotive industry to a supply chain-centric automotive industry, we have to change our thinking. And so we have to get our arms around what do we need to focus on to start that shift immediately. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit more about that in a second. The next thing is we have to really assess the skill sets in our organization. I do a lot of work in the industry with suppliers at their plant facilities, helping them to get compliant to their OEMs audits and get their certification for the OEM. And when I go there, often the people that are there are maybe quality people that are trying to run supply chain but don't understand supply chain processes. Sometimes today, because it's so difficult to get good employees, we don't necessarily get people who have been educated in university at the supply chain, so they have to come up and learn all of these skills on their own, and they don't have those as they enter into our workforce. And so that's a really big issue because we quickly, again, have to switch to this supply chain focus for the future. So we need to be able to assess those skill sets of the employees, both at the plant level and at corporate. Once we identify those gaps, what is it that they don't need? What do we need to educate them on? We need to quickly get them up to speed on those competencies, make sure that they can have that competency. At that point, we really have a focus now. We have an organization in operations that can move from that manufacturing centric to the supply chain centric organization. So we can start to head in that direction for the speed that we're going to need in the supply chain to be able to respond to these orders in the future. And then last but not least, as Kathy had said, we're going to need to integrate and automate. There was a statistic that I have here. It said 62% of companies currently still rely on spreadsheets for information. That is not going to suffice in the future when we need to understand quickly if we're going to be able to make that vehicle for that consumer as they order across the internet. That's just not going to be sustainable. The other thing is 79%, I noted here, are in their early stages of a digital transformation. We hear a lot about digital transformation. And I would say that is going to have to escalate and get going, moving along the spectrum much faster, because we're going to have to become more of go from a reactive, we're trying to move over the last few years to predictive, move more and more to a predictive environment. So we know when things are going to happen because we can look at our data, it's in a system, we can analyze it, and we have those metrics that will tell us what's going on within our organization. So we feel these are really 5 key steps that we need for a sustainable supply chain in the future. Next slide. So these are these 24 essential supply chain processes that Kathy and I have been discussing and alluding to here throughout the presentation. What Kathy and I did is we looked at IATF 16949, and we looked at MMOGLE, which is an industry standard or benchmark for the best practices in supply chain. So Kathy and I got together and we said, let's look at that. If we were really going to start to break down these silos between quality and delivery and move towards an ecosystem, even within our own organization, that's looking at everything from a 360 view, where would we start? So when we looked at the IETF, actually these 24 topics are actually in the standard today. There's fingerprints, though, of supply chain. They're not strong on supply chain, but there is definitely some note of supply chain there. And so we looked through all of these, and what we really recommended was a roadmap for how we can strengthen in each one of these topics internally to get more stronger at and to get that 360 view of all these processes. So let me give you a couple examples of what I'm talking about. One of my favorite, and Kathy's too, is contingency planning, right? If I go to a supplier, manufacturing facility, and say, show me your contingency plans, I typically get all the quality related contingency plans. And I'll tell them, but I'm here for a supply chain review. Where is your emergency plan if an ASN doesn't show up? You know, where is your emergency plan if you don't have enough containers? Where is your emergency plan or contingency plan if your customer's transportation provider doesn't show up? Those are typically not there. And what is there is typically at such a high level, it's very difficult that anybody could really react on that contingency plan and really execute it to complete success. So again, if we bring quality and supply chain together, let's look at all the factors that could disrupt that manufacturing facility. Another one of my favorites is under operational controls, procedures and work instructions. If I look at, if you don't have quality and delivery at the same table, what I typically find is procedures are mostly processes and work instructions that are written at a high level out of quality. But if you look on the supply chain side, we are in planning systems, ERP systems all day long, so they need to be really detailed. So if somebody doesn't show up for work, a backup can replace them, right? And the level and the quality that I see of work instructions is really lacking because I think the way quality approaches it, there needs to be a little bit of different change for how supply chain needs to approach their work instructions and the level of detail that they need. I mean, COVID was a great example. The executive director of General Motors prior to the semiconductor issue said his biggest headache was people not being able to make it to work because of COVID, and there was nobody there to back up their processes that understood how to do that job, which tells me right away that procedures and work instructions in the supply chain area, and even in general, are really not where they're supposed to be. So Kathy and I have really mapped out a plan where these are the 24 points that we need to start to bring that supply chain focus. Next slide. So from an industry's perspective, Kathy and I are both very actively involved in the Automotive Industry Action Group, or the AIAG. I know AIAG supports all of North America for us. And some things that have been going on over the last few months. We've obviously had a lot of disruptions, the COVID, the semiconductors, labor disruptions. And, you know, this is really coming to the forefront, even of AIAG, the supply chain saying we need help, right? So myself and Kathy are actually currently on a team where we are developing a risk assessment exam. So this is a place, again, where your people can come in supply chain, take an exam and see where are they in relationship to best practices for supply chain. And it's not necessarily to pass or fail anybody, it's to identify gaps and how we need to educate them and where they need further education. From here, there's discussion going on right now about developing a supply chain basics training that we could maybe potentially even, I would even hope that maybe even possibly this year, it hasn't been decided yet, it's being proposed right now, where we could start to develop the supply chain basics. So we make sure that tier 2 through tier 3 who really need to understand how to manage supply chain gets education. This also could be for the tier 1s who are seeing turnover in their supply chain operations. And lastly, for those quality folks in quality. So again, they can start to understand supply chain, and we can get that whole ecosystem going internally as well as externally. And then there's the MMO-GLE training, which is more an advanced class on best practices for supply chain. AIG currently has everything that you see in the purple. These are assessments that are already available, that are out there that can help you in managing your supply chain. Those 24 key topics that I talked to you about is represented in the supply chain and QMS integration. We are currently actively talking to a lot of people. A lot of people believe that those 24 topics should get put into the IATF standard. We're not sure where that's going to go yet. But even if it doesn't make it to the IATF standard, those are 24 topics that you should start working on immediately to see where you're at and to start creating this focus within your organization. And then at the bottom, there are already some recommendations that AIAG has to help explain what best practices KPIs are in the industry and what a good logistics agreement looks like. So we feel that AIG has a lot of the components to really, and a good start, to be able to get us in that direction that maybe most companies aren't familiar with. Next slide. So once we have everybody trained and we're all on the same page, and we've broken those silos and we're acting as one holistic organization, now we've got our operations, we got it really focused, and we can really move towards that seamless coordination of our supplier requirements. Next slide. And then last but not least, we talked about technology and how important that is to this whole process. We all know that before you apply technology, it's best to think about the process and get the process where you want it to be, and then apply the technology. So what are some of the technologies that you're going to want to be looking at as you move forward? Again, we cannot sustain on spreadsheets. We're not going to be able to move fast enough. You know, we found that when people do start to really better enhance their processes. I personally have worked with suppliers where we've been able to get them a 15 to a 60% reduction in inventory because they are streamlining the coordination of demand between their customers and their suppliers, and they're reducing inventory as well. So first of all, we need an ERP based on a platform. If your ERP is probably anywhere from 5 to 10 years old, it's probably not based on a platform. What is a platform? What a platform allows you to do is take all that rich data that you have in your system and be able to apply analytics so that we can get to be predictive. We can have the system looking behind the scene and raising its hand when maybe a supplier needs to be looked at, because we can apply advanced technologies like machine learning that are always looking behind the scenes for us in that platform, because it's got all this data rich sitting in the system. It's not buried in Excel spreadsheets or Word documents on somebody's C drive within the organization. It's there so we can analyze it and move quickly. The other area that we have good tools for today is in scenario planning. We all know that we get the releases and the schedules in, and that covers, you know, the shipping schedules cover up to 14 days. And we know that the releases sometimes anywhere from a half year to a year. But outside of that, we don't have good planning information. And again, we need to get better at that. You know, we're seeing that in the electric vehicles are coming on now a little bit stronger than they have in the past globally. So, you know, how is that demand going to increase? How is the internal combustion engine type cars going to decrease? What happens if another version of COVID hits us next year? Those different scenarios where we want to be thinking longer term, what does it look like, right? Because we have to keep that eye on the supply chain. An interesting thing that I learned the other day in attending a webinar was that when they debriefed and they really looked at what happened with the semiconductor issue. You know what it was? It was that the tier 2 was not giving enough visibility to the tier 3 for semiconductors. They were only giving 14 weeks. Well, the semiconductor industry needs anywhere from 22 to 24 weeks. So if you're not giving your suppliers enough lead time, then when you start to ramp back up again, they're going to say, I don't have visibility that you wanted those, right? So that's really, really important. And so again, all the demand and scenario planning with our customers is really critical. The next one, and I've talked to Kathy about this a lot, I cannot believe that IATF 16949 does not mandate that your quality has to be in an automated system. I don't know how any organization can be effective, even at the corporate level, when all this information is buried again on the plant C drive and Excel spreadsheets and Word documents. You have to have visibility to that for speed, to recognize that you have a problem in your supply base or with your customer or internally. So it's so critical to get that process automated. And then demand and delivery systems. So you with your suppliers, right? Making sure they quickly know what your requirements are, what your forecast is, what your schedule is. They can tell you quickly when products are shipping from them. But even if we step back on a broader level, looking back where you can really collaborate between you and your suppliers, they get a holistic view of supporting you as a customer because they can see their corrective actions in the system when they log on to your portals. They can see what their delivery is. You've identified maybe that they have a risk in some place. You've identified corrective actions to them. You've got a one-stop shopping where everything is integrated and automated, again, for that speed of delivery that we need in the future to move to a supply chain focus. Next slide. So when we look at it here, again, what is it that your next steps are? What do you need to do? Well, first of all, we hope that you'd really take a look at those 24 steps that we've put together. Kathy and I are happy to talk to anybody. You'll get our emails at the end if you want more information on those 24 steps. So you really need to look at those and start to bring quality and delivery or supply chain together to start really talking about those processes again from a holistic view. Then you need to go and start looking at those competencies. How am I going to get good supply chain processes, get people understanding those best practices of supply chain within my organization? It's a skill you're going to have to master for the future. And then getting to that organizational structure, that culture where you're focused on the supply chain. You are holistically looking at everything internally and externally in that automotive ecosystem. And then last but not least, start looking at where you can start step by step implementing technology to help you get those answers, help you to get those predictive analytics much faster than you probably are today if they're buried in spreadsheets. Next slide. So in conclusion, Mike Dickinson, he's actually the supply chain director at Lotus. He worked quite a bit with us. We interviewed him quite a bit because he's such an expert on supply chain. He worked at General Motors prior to going to Lotus. And so we interviewed him extensively for his thoughts on the direction that we're going. And I really like the last paragraph of his quote here. So if we don't join this party, we will not only remain as one of the key limiting factors, we could actually become the limiting factor in the future progress of the automotive industry. So if we as an industry don't all get on board and start looking at this holistically, putting supply chain as a key importance, we're going to lose the game. And Kathy and I talk about this all the time. We're just waiting for the day that you're going to order a car on Amazon and they're going to be able to deliver that car to you. So it's something that we want to leave you with. We believe it's an imperative and we believe that you need to act today. Thank you. And Gonzalo, back to you.
Thank you, Ron. Now, how can Qrik and Keystem help you? Okay, for some reason I cannot start my video, but Qrik has a bunch of automotive industry solutions. This can go from the ERP based on a platform that Terry was talking about, but also you need an ERP system that can also take advantage of all the new technologies that are in place based on Industry 4.0 and all the new technologies that will help us face all the disruption we are having, and also everything related to scenario planning. And in addition to automotive solutions, and we will list a few of them in a next slide, we also have MMOGLE training. As you know, we were mentioning that Terry is expert in MMOGLE. She works very closely with AIAG in Michigan, and we are in Mexico. Qrik is the only approved provider of MMOGLE training for Mexico, and we also have another service that is an assessment. So if you think you are ready to submit your assessments to the OEM, we can help you review and see if it actually will match what the OEM is expecting. In addition, we have a series of webinars. We will show you a list of what our next webinars in the following slide. And then finally, we will have an integrated supply chain white paper, industry white paper. This is in the works right now, and you will all get a copy, a complimentary copy when it's ready. So based on the email you used for your registration. And with this, we would like to open up for a final poll. This is if you are interested in any of the solutions we have been mentioning in this webinar, if this could be quality management system, MMOGLE training, or the assessment. If you are interested in renewing your cloud ERP, if you would like to hear about the demand and delivery management system or supplier collaboration, or if you're not interested, there is an option for that as well. So help us to fill out this final poll. Now with the webinars, we have a deep dive webinar series, all related to automotive and the supply chain. So in this, we will be able to review what are the ways we can manage our supply chain more effectively, what are the risks of the supply chain. So we will have this in March 16, March 17, March 18, and we will keep you informed in any future webinar we have. So the registration link will be sent to you in the thank you email that will be sent along with the recording of this webinar. And finally, we would like to open it up for questions. Our contact information is just in the right. If you like to take a screenshot or just write down our emails, we will be happy to connect with you and help you if you have any additional questions or anything else you would like to help. We can help you with. All right, and let's see if we have any questions here in the. Okay, there's some questions about if we will be sharing this presentation, and the answer is yes, we will share the recording of this webinar. Okay, so yeah, you will receive a thank you email with a link of the recording. Don't worry about that. And we have one question that I would like to direct that to Terry. One question is, what are the benefits of MMOGLE training for my company to take?
Good question. So MMOGLE training, I think, is a really great way to start. MMOGLE has 187, I like to call them best practices. So it's a great benchmark to see, is your organization following all these best practices? And when you get done taking the assessment, it tells you whether you're A, meaning you're world class, or C, you have serious deficiency. So it's a really good place to start to examine your own supply chain department and where they feel that they're at in that process. I would really highly suggest that you answer it. It is a self-assessment, so You could make it so you get a level A, but I ask that you really take it seriously and see where you're really at in your organizations. I often find when I go into suppliers, they've marked themselves as a level A when in fact they're truly a level C. And so I think it will give you, a really honest assessment about how good your operations are. It's also required by several OEMs like Ford and Fiat Chrysler recommended, as well as Peugeot, which is now going to be merged with Stellantis as well. It's not FCA, that's right. They merged together, and Renault. So some OEMs actually require it, but I would really encourage you, even if you are not required to take it, it's an excellent place to start to really start to begin to do an honest assessment of where you're at with supply chain.
Thank you very much, Terry. Yeah, I've been involved with MMGLE myself, and yeah, I think this is a great way to start to see if we are really a world-class company in terms of supply chain processes. Thank you very much.
I wanted to add one other thing. I've found that every company that has taken the MMOGLE and they take it seriously, and the corrective actions that they have to do to get to that level A have reduced inventory anywhere from 15% to 60%. So if you have too much inventory, you need to take that assessment because it's going to identify where you need to improve. I just wanted to add that too. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Terry. Next question, I think I will redirect this to Kathy. What would you say are the biggest lessons learned from the auto industry after COVID-19?
It's a great question. I would say probably the biggest lesson learned had to do with contingency plans and their lack of detail in particular. And Gonzalo, I don't know if you can go back maybe to the slide that we had our 24 topics, the 24 processes. I saw in the Q&A that somebody was asking about this one. And I wanted to refer to this one in particular because there's another question that we saw around what are the topics that we should focus on in a contingency plan from a supply chain standpoint. And actually, it's those very topics that we have around program planning, and operational control. And these in particular were processes that were impacted significantly by COVID, that most organizations didn't have contingency plans in place. And so they were really suffering to try and restart their operations seamlessly, and in particular, be able to respond to the changes that were taking place in customer demand as well. And so that was one of the key things, was really strengthening contingency plans. And we're starting to see organizations really get a little bit more detail in their contingency plans. But as Terry mentioned, most organizations are driven to document contingency plans because of the IATF 16949 requirement on contingency plans. And where that requirement does lightly touch upon supply chain, it really does not get into the nitty-gritty details. And rather, we find that a lot of times organizations are simply addressing those topics that are called out in the IATF 16949, rather than looking at the processes of their business that could be impacted, whether it be from a disruption externally or even a disruption internally within their own organization, and then establishing those contingency plans to ensure that that disruption or that disrupting factor does not create a disruption in their delivery performance. And so a great place to start is with these three categories: the program planning, and operational control processes, and looking at how your organization is accomplishing these processes, what risks may exist within your organization in consistently producing or managing these processes, and then building those contingency plans alongside of that. The other lesson learned that came out of COVID, and I'd like to have Terry speak to this, was that there was a great increased awareness on the need to automate. So Terry, I'm sure you've got some comments to that point.
Yes, that was one of the biggest lessons learned, that I think really is starting people to look at digital transformation. I think people quickly found out that they couldn't respond fast enough. They couldn't get the data quick enough out of their systems, and also even in that area of scenario planning, like, okay, what is the future going to look like? How do I figure that out based on different things that might happen? So those tools definitely came out high on the top of people really wanting to look at that, as well as how to better collaborate with suppliers, because again, when the customer changes their order, whether it goes up or down, you got to get that information down the supply chain. And then really, again, like I'd mentioned before, looking more towards predictive analytics. So it can raise its hand. The system's looking in the background while you're busy working on a problem, telling you, hey, these 3 conditions just happened. I think you need to go look at the supplier, or you need to go look at that issue. So I think that was another big lessons learned too.
Thank you both. We're receiving some similar questions. One that it's interesting to me is what are the best practices that you would recommend for our suppliers in terms of communications and inventory management?
Yeah, Terry, do you want to take a stab at that first? And I've got some thoughts as well.
So what I have seen work successfully time and time again is to make sure that you're electronically communicating with 100% of your suppliers. Oftentimes, even if people are doing EDI or they have a web portal, if a supplier says, well, I'm a mom and pop shop, or I'm a small company, I can't afford it, those typically are the ones that are going to cause you the disruption. And often we tend to be nice and say, okay, we won't push you to do it. Really, what we need to strive to, we have to get 100% connected. And what we find when you get 100% connected is, even I've found those little suppliers, they get that visibility into what you need much faster than you having them go to a shared drive or send them an Excel spreadsheet through email. And by the speed that they get that information, they can respond to you faster. And the net that comes out is that you're eliminating premium freight, you're right sizing inventory because there's no lags or there's a delay. There's that complete open book where one version of the truth, where you both can see what needs to happen. So I'm a big believer in electronically communicating requirements and making sure you're doing that at 100%, because I have seen that work time and time again to right size inventory. And I would even recommend your lower tier suppliers. We are in a society that embraces technology, and it's almost sad in automotive supply chain. We almost give it an excuse. Well, they're too small, they're too little. Everybody's going to have to get automated for success in the future. So we're going to really have to mitigate these manual processes throughout the supply chain. So I think that's one of the very key things that you need to do, is to be communicating demand either via EDI or a portal and make that happen down the supply chain.
Yeah, and I would say on top of automating that is really being able to have that visibility through the supply chain. And one of our program planning topics here, we call it customer communication, is really ensuring that there's a well-defined communication plan between your organization, your customers, and your organization and your suppliers. Sometimes you need to take the lead on that because maybe your customers or suppliers are not going to ask. But this could be something as simple as making sure that the key points of contact and the different functions of your organization are identified, their contact information is clearly made available, and that information is also maintained. Part of your contingency planning is also checking that those communication networks are actually functioning, that there hasn't been changes that have been overlooked and not corrected as well. From the management of inventory perspective, I really feel that, again, this comes back to the focus of automation and having visibility of inventory all the way down the supply chain, as well as understanding the constraints that the down tier suppliers are facing in terms of raw material availability and their lead times within their operations. Unfortunately, if we kind of think back to that linear view of our supply chain that we've so often operated by, we tend to only worry about the supplier rate behind us and what our customer is asking for. And clearly, as we are migrating more towards integration of the vehicle design, the supply chain has got to become integrated as well. And the communications, especially even related to inventory management, have got to go beyond just the customer in front of you and the supplier behind you. It really has to be a lot more holistic. And this is where leveraging automation definitely can benefit your organization.
And Kathy, just to add to that, that's why I think organizations like AIAG even in those lower tiers, there's a basic assessment they can do for supply chain. So
Yeah.
if you're a tier 1, you could be telling the tier 2, I want you to implement some type of an assessment that really requires some of these things, and ask the lower tiers to look at it. We got to probably make sure we're communicating, we're all on the same page, that everybody needs to play the exact same game, and for us to win in the long run.
Good, thank you. We have two related questions. One is related to what is your perception of the Mexico's supply chain compared to China or other things of the world, other places in the world? And also, when do you think the problem of steel will be now more stable? And probably I could add semiconductors and all the disruptions we're having right now.
Terry, let's look at our crystal balls.
Okay, yeah, I can take the steel. I think the steel, one of the shocking things to me about the semiconductor is when they looked at, it's funny because I was telling my colleagues, I actually teach this point in my MMO GLE training, is that if your customer has an inventory policy, like if they tell you, I want you to, whether it's a strike, I need you to bank 3 months worth of it, or in the case of electronics, a lot of the OEMs tell their suppliers, the tier 1s, I want you to keep 22 weeks of inventory, and I want you to pass that down the supply chain, let the next tier know. And what ended up happening is that it broke down, because when it got to the lower tiers, instead of, say, for instance, passing along the 22 weeks that the OEM had suggested, they were only passing along 14 weeks. Well, that's not enough lead time for them as you come back up. And in the meantime, they had already shifted their demand to the consumer electronics industry. So a couple things that I would really suggest is that you look at, do I have an inventory policy? You should be asking those questions on some key components. What should it be? And then look at yourself and say, am I giving my suppliers that inventory policy? And am I giving them enough lead time and requirements in my EDI data that covers out to 22 weeks, if that's what it needs, or whatever it ends up being. So you're looking at those longest lead time parts, and you're making sure that the whole chain is aware and they're on the same page. To me, it was a very simple mistake. And I was actually quite surprised, to be honest, that ended up being one of the major root causes, is just that lack of communication of what inventory levels need to be throughout the supply chain. And back to what Kathy said, we're so used to OEM to tier 1. Tier 1 has to tell tier 2, and has to tell tier 2, you need to tell tier 3 at this point in time. So I think that's something that should be go back and looked at and see if that may be an issue that's causing some of the issues with the steel and the resins. We have to look at ports now are causing issues. There's a lot of different areas with disruption that we have to really take a look at.
Yeah, and I also wanted to just weigh in on the point regarding comparing the supply chain in Mexico, supply chain in China. And, to say we have seen a trend back towards localization for a number of reasons, the tariffs just being one of them, of course. But the truth of the matter is we are global supply chains. Mm-hmm. That's not going to change. It doesn't matter how much reshoring and localization organizations undertake. The only remedy, let's say, for any organization to not have to depend on a supply chain is to become vertically integrated. And we are seeing a trend back towards that. I remember early in my career working for General Motors, and the story being told, well, we dig the ore, we mine the ore and smelt it and cast it and machine it and so on and so forth. And when I look at General Motors as an organization today, it's quite different than back in the 1980s when I first started with them. But the truth of the matter is, there's realistically any organization, even those that are endeavoring, especially in the BEV, the battery electric vehicle space, to vertically integrate, you're still going to have some dependence on a supply chain, and we need to get excellent at managing those processes. First of all, recognizing those processes, defining them, and managing those processes, and recognize too that supply chain is global and it shall ever be global, especially as we are trying to support the new technologies, because there's no nation that has all of the resources to operate independently. And it's not practical or even financially feasible for any country to be able to develop all of those competencies within their own borders as well.
Perfect, thank you. There's another question in how all these concepts that we are reviewing today can be spread along, understood, and implemented in all the plants with OEMs. I would like to tier 1, tier 2, tier N suppliers around the world. How do you think this could be made possible?
Well, and that's really why, as we were looking at the information that exists currently in the IATF 16949 standard and comparing that with MMOGLE, we recognized there was a lot of synergies. You know, typically, and I hate to say unfortunately, but we tend to, in the automotive industry, respond when something is a requirement, when it's a mandate. So for instance, you know, over the years, we've mandated quality management system certification in order to, I don't want to say encourage, but really force automotive suppliers to develop those processes that are essential to ensure customer satisfaction. In a way, we could leverage that same basis of a quality management system and incorporating these supply chain requirements so that they become a part of the automotive industry, just as the quality requirements have become a standard across the industry globally as well. So that's really the direction that we're proposing. Obviously, that's a big leap for the industry because there's still a very strong mindset that separates quality from supply chain, but the reality is that's not what our customers see. I mean, those of you who receive your customer scorecards, what's on there? Quality, delivery. Yeah, there's some other things, cost, etc. But I mean, the primary drivers of evaluation are quality and delivery. Customers expect you to be able to deliver on time, every time. And that's going to be, there's more pressure of that as we move towards these online buying models for consumers, especially in the for vehicles as well. And so one of the things I wanted to also mention, just to kind of reinforce how important on time, every time with good quality is to the automotive customers, just last week, the IATF announced that they're introducing what they call a risk-based audit day calculation. And so in the past, the audit days for your IATF audits were based on a very specific table and the number of people working inside of your organization. That's still going to hold true, but with this new risk-based audit frame, if your organization is in red status or not meeting your customers' requirements for delivery and quality, then those IATF auditors are going to be spending more time at your organization digging into your corrective actions. And what we've seen, especially over the past several years, is that most suppliers that are having issues with their customers, especially at the OEM level, it's not typically quality issues, it's typically delivery issues. So that's a big concern that we're seeing, you know, a lot of the tier ones are struggling with how do we effectively address these delivery issues so that we can keep our customers happy. And at the same time, you know, we don't want to have those extra audit days just because, you know, we've got a poor score. We want to make sure that we're addressing them proactively.
Perfect. Thank you, Kathy. We are almost running out of time, so I'm sharing with you here in the presentation the next dates for our webinars. There were some people asking about this, so here's in the screen the dates and the topics that we will be covering in our next webinars, and you will get some the invitation in the thank you email that you will receive. And I would like to just close it up with our contact information. In case you need anything else, any additional question, anything you feel that we can help you with, feel free to contact us. Here are our email addresses. And thank you very much, everyone, for your attendance to this webinar. We will be in contact with you for any future webinars that we will have. We will be very happy to share with you all this information. Thank you, Kathy, once again. Thank you, Terry.
Thank you, Gonzalo.
Thank you.
And bye-bye.
Bye-bye.